Breaking news just in on legendary New Zealand actor Sam Neill, with word in the last few moments he's passed away. The beloved Kiwi actor and Jurassic Park star died peacefully in Sydney, surrounded by his family.
There was a man who walked among dinosaurs on the biggest screens in the world, who poured his own wine from vines he planted himself in the mountains of New Zealand's South Island, who wrote a memoir about cancer in a hospital ward between chemotherapy sessions because he was too restless and too curious and too thoroughly alive to simply wait, and who told the world, with a directness that was entirely his own, that the prospect of dying was not frightening. It was merely irritating. There was too much left to do. Today, on the 13th of July, 2026, the world learned that Sam Neill, actor, winemaker, storyteller, and one of the most quietly extraordinary human beings that international cinema ever placed in front of a camera, has passed away suddenly in Sydney, Australia. He was 78 years old. He had, in the months before his death, been declared cancer-free. The loss, his family confirmed, was sudden and unexpected, and the fact that it came after the cancer had been beaten. After the years of treatment, after the clinical trials, after the extraordinary medical fight that he had waged with the same unhurried, matter-of-fact courage that he brought to everything, makes it the kind of news that takes a moment to fully land. A brief but important note before we go any further. Everything shared in this video is drawn from verified public sources, confirmed interviews, Sam Neill's own published memoir, and the documented public record. This is not speculation. This is a tribute, offered today, to a man who deserved far better than to be reduced to a highlight reel, and who, given how he lived, would almost certainly have had something dry and funny to say about the very idea of one. If Sam Neill ever made you forget you were watching a performance, if his presence on screen ever made the story feel true rather than constructed, leave a tribute in the comments below. Because the story of Sam Neill is not a story of Hollywood. It is a story of a man who consistently, stubbornly, and without apology refused to become the thing the entertainment industry kept trying to turn him into. And that refusal, sustained across more than 5 decades of one of the most diverse and accomplished acting careers in the English-speaking world, is itself a kind of achievement worth understanding. His name, when he came into the world on the 14th of September, 1947, was not Sam. It was Nigel John Dermot Neill, born in Omagh, in what was then Northern Ireland, into a family with deep roots in both the military and in commerce. His father, Dermot Neill, had served with distinction, and the household young Nigel grew up in was one that carried the particular weight of an era shaped by war and its aftermath. Serious in its expectations, precise in its standards, and not especially given to theatrical ambition as a viable life direction. When Nigel was 7 years old, the family made the journey that would define the geography of his life. They emigrated to New Zealand, settling in Christchurch on the South Island, a place of extraordinary physical beauty and a cultural life that was, in the 1950s, still finding its confident footing in the world. The name change came later, at university, and through the particular logic of social necessity rather than artistic reinvention. 2 of his closest friends were also called Nigel. The name Sam, borrowed with the casual pragmatism of a young man who found the situation mildly absurd, stuck. It suited him, as it turned out, not because it transformed him into someone else, but because it contained him more accurately than the name he had been given. Sam, direct, approachable, slightly irregular. The name of a man you could have a long conversation with and not be entirely sure afterward whether he had been performing or simply being himself. The answer, for everyone who knew him and everyone who worked with him across 5 decades, was always the same. He was simply being himself. The performance and the person were, in the end, the same thing. He did not train as an actor. This is a biographical detail that deserves to be held for a moment because it cuts against the entire architecture of how we understand serious careers in a serious craft. He did not go to drama school. He did not study Stanislavski or spend years in workshops or apprentice himself to a theatrical tradition in the way that the majority of his peers did. He joined the drama club at the University of Canterbury as one joins things at university, with curiosity rather than vocation, with an openness to experience that had not yet hardened into a plan. What he discovered there was not a calling in the religious sense, but something more modest and more durable, an aptitude, a natural ease in front of an audience, a quality, difficult to define and impossible to manufacture, that directors and producers tend to describe in the inadequate language available to them as presence. His first film role came in 1977, in a film called Sleeping Dogs, New Zealand's first color feature film. And it arrived not through years of careful cultivation of industry contacts, but through the simple fact that he was there, that he was convincing, and that the New Zealand film industry of the late 1970s was small enough that being convincing in a university drama club was not such a distant credential from being cast in a feature film. The industry he was entering was in its infancy, and Sam Neill was one of the people who grew up with it, who helped define what it could be and what it was worth taking seriously. The decisive turn came through an Australian producer named Margaret Fink, who saw in him something that the New Zealand industry had not yet had the full infrastructure to develop: a leading man. Fink brought him across the Tasman for a film called My Brilliant Career in 1979, directed by Gillian Armstrong and starring Judy Davis in the role that would make her one of the most celebrated actresses of her generation. Sam Neill played the romantic lead, charming, complex, and convincingly ambivalent, in a film that would become one of the foundational texts of Australian cinema. Australia, he later said, became his second home. He meant it in the literal sense. For decades, he maintained a life there that ran alongside and intertwined with his life in New Zealand, his career in Hollywood, and his growing commitment to the vines he was planting in central Otago. The Australian years produced films that expanded his range in directions that purely commercial cinema would not have required of him. Dead Calm, in 1989, a psychological thriller directed by Philip Noyce, placed him alongside Nicole Kidman in a film of genuine tension and craft, the kind of film that demonstrates what an actor can do when the material is worthy of the effort. Evil Angels, known in some markets as A Cry in the Dark, directed by Fred Schapisi and starring Meryl Streep, gave him a role in one of the most significant Australian films ever made, the dramatization of the Lindy Chamberlain case, one of the most divisive and morally complex legal stories in Australian history. Through both films, something became clear that would define the long middle stretch of his career. Sam Neill was not simply a capable actor in the technical sense, he was a genuinely interesting one. An actor who brought to every role a quality of inner life that the camera picked up and the audience felt even when they could not name it. Hollywood, when it came in two registers. The first was the kind of global, event-scale fame that arrives suddenly and does not ask permission. The Hunt for Red October in 1990, directed by John McTiernan from Tom Clancy's novel, placed him alongside Sean Connery at the height of that actor's second act and introduced him to an American audience of considerable size. He was precise, authoritative, and quietly commanding, everything the role required and nothing it did not. But it was 1993 that changed the mathematics of his public recognition permanently. Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park, one of the highest-grossing films in cinema history, gave him the role of Dr. Alan Grant, a paleontologist whose scientific certainty is systematically dismantled by the living proof of everything he thought he understood about extinction. The film was a phenomenon by any measure, and Sam Neill was at the center of it. Skeptical, capable, and more than occasionally terrified in the way that only a genuinely good actor can make terror feel earned rather than performed. He returned to the role in Jurassic Park 3 in 2001, and again in Jurassic World Dominion in 2022, and each return was characterized by the same quality that had made the first performance so compelling: a complete absence of condescension toward the material, a willingness to engage fully with what the story required, and the dry, controlled wit that was in every role he ever played because it was simply part of who he was. He was, as one colleague put it, constitutionally incapable of phoning it in, not because he lacked the cynicism that long experience in any industry tends to produce, but because the work itself was too interesting to him to be done badly. The second register of his Hollywood career was the one that the industry itself consistently undervalued, but that the best directors understood immediately: his capacity for dramatic depth in quieter, more demanding material. Jane Campion's The Piano in 1993 gave him one of the most complex roles of his career. Alastair Stewart, a man of rigid propriety in colonial New Zealand whose fundamental inability to connect with the woman he married creates the conditions for everything the film becomes. It was not an easy role. It was not a sympathetic one, in any straightforward sense. And he played it with the particular courage of an actor who has no interest in being liked when the truth of a character requires something harder. The film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. It won 3 Academy Awards. And Sam Neill's performance remained one of the most discussed and most respected elements of a film that the critical conversation still returns to, decades later, as one of the defining works of its era. Television, throughout the later decades of his career, gave him a different kind of stage, and he used it with the same unshowy precision he brought to everything else. His appearance in Peaky Blinders as Chester Campbell, a detective of consuming menace and implacable authority, reminded an audience that had grown up with him in blockbusters that the range available to him was considerably wider than any single franchise could contain. His work across both film and television earned him the AACTA Award for Best Actor in a Leading Role, multiple Logie Awards, the New Zealand Film Award for Outstanding Contribution to Cinema, and in 2019, the Longford Lyell Award, the highest honor conferred by the Australian Academy of Cinema and Television Arts, for a lifetime of achievement across both industries that had claimed him as their own. He received the honor with the grace and the barely concealed bemusement that characterized his relationship with institutional recognition across an entire career. "I continue to be immensely grateful," he said, collecting the award, "for the opportunity to work here and the generosity that Australia has shown me for no really good reason." The room laughed. They always laughed when Sam Neill said things like that, because the humor was real, and the modesty was real, and the particular quality of a man who has arrived at genuine self-knowledge without allowing it to become a performance was entirely visible in every word he said and every word he left unsaid. Off the film set, he was most fully himself on his beloved vineyards on New Zealand's South Island. Two Paddocks, the winery he founded in 1993, the same year Jurassic Park opened in cinemas around the world, began with 5 acres of Pinot Noir planted at Gibbston in central Otago, in the high country of the South Island, where the climate is difficult and the results, when the conditions align, are extraordinary. It was not a vanity project, and it was never treated like one. He developed the enterprise with genuine seriousness, expanding it eventually to 4 certified organic vineyards in the central Otago region, each one reflecting the same commitment to craft and the same refusal to cut corners that characterized his acting career. Two Paddocks Pinot Noir became, over the decades, wine of genuine international reputation, the kind that earned its place on the basis of what was in the bottle rather than the name on the label, though the name on the label did not hurt. He spoke about the vineyard the way he spoke about everything he loved, with specificity, with warmth, and with the quiet authority of a man who has actually done the work. "You hear that sound?" he said once, holding a glass of wine that had been fermenting for 4 weeks, completely and utterly delicious. The pleasure was real. The enthusiasm was unperformed. In a career defined by the convincing simulation of emotional states, the moments when Sam Neill was simply and straightforwardly happy were always easy to identify because they looked nothing like acting. He was also, particularly in the later years of his life, remarkably and entertainingly present on social media, a medium that most people of his generation approached with the caution appropriate to an unfamiliar foreign country. Sam Neill approached it with the openness of a man who found other people genuinely interesting and who had enough to say and enough wit with which to say it that the platform simply became another room he walked into and made his own. During the pandemic lockdowns of 2020, his cooking videos, characterized by the deadpan self-awareness that made everything he did watchable, became a small and genuine cultural moment. He was not performing domesticity for an audience. He was cooking dinner and talking about it, and the fact that he was Sam Neill doing this was both the whole joke and the whole point. Then came the diagnosis that he chose, characteristically, to handle on his own terms. In March of 2022, Sam Neill was diagnosed with stage 3 angioimmunoblastic T-cell lymphoma, a rare and serious form of blood cancer. The initial treatment involved chemotherapy, and the initial prognosis was one that would have undone a less constitutionally grounded person. He was told that he would likely need ongoing chemotherapy for the rest of his life to manage the disease rather than cure it. He received this information with the directness that was his most consistent quality across every domain of his existence. He wrote about it. In the hospital, between treatment sessions, sitting with the uncomfortable facts of his own mortality in a ward that offered very little by way of distraction, he wrote a memoir, not a cancer memoir, a life memoir, written while he was being treated for cancer, because the alternative, simply waiting, simply being sick, simply allowing the illness to become the entire conversation, was not something he was willing to accept. "Did I ever tell you this?" published in 2023 was the result. Funny, honest, discursive, generous, and entirely characteristic of the man who wrote it, it moved through 5 decades of film career, vineyard life, fatherhood, friendship, and the particular texture of a life lived with genuine attention, and it arrived at cancer not as a climax but as a context, something that was happening to him while everything else continued. Something that was, he said with a characteristic shrug of the prose, not very interesting to him. He had other things on his mind. The prospect of death, he admitted, was irritating. There was too much left to do. The initial treatment was not sufficient for a cure, and when the chemotherapy reached the limits of what it could achieve, he pursued an alternative. He enrolled in a clinical trial in Australia involving CAR T-cell therapy, a revolutionary form of immunotherapy in which a patient's own T-cells are extracted, genetically modified to recognize and attack cancer cells, and then reintroduced into the body. It is a treatment at the frontier of what oncology can currently offer, and it carried, as all frontier treatments carry, both significant promise and significant uncertainty. In April of 2026, he announced publicly that the trial had succeeded. He was cancer-free. The announcement was made with the same measured understatement that he had brought to the diagnosis, to the treatment, and to the writing of a memoir in a hospital bed. The tone of a man who was pleased, who was grateful, who was perhaps more moved than he allowed his public language to show, but who was not, under any circumstances, going to make more of a spectacle of his own relief than the situation required. He did not have long to enjoy what he had earned. On the 13th of July, 2026 today, as this is being recorded, Sam Neill died suddenly in Sydney, Australia. The cause of death has not yet been confirmed in the public record. His family confirmed that the loss was sudden and unexpected, and that he remained, at the time of his passing, cancer-free. He was 78 years old. He left behind 4 children and 8 grandchildren. He left behind the vineyards at Central Otago that he had been tending for more than 30 years. He left behind a filmography of more than 100 credits across 5 decades, ranging from art cinema to global blockbuster, from television drama to the kind of quiet, character-driven work that rewards the audience willing to pay attention. He left behind a memoir written between chemotherapy sessions because he could not stop being curious about his own life long enough to simply be sick. And he left behind the particular quality that no award ceremony could quite name, and no career retrospective could fully capture. The impression, felt by everyone who watched him work, and by everyone who spoke about him after, that here was a man who had been genuinely, unhurriedly, and irreplaceably himself. He was a celebrated actor and a reluctant star. He said it plainly, with the ease of someone who had long since made peace with the distinction. He had friends who were stars. He would not swap his life for theirs. He could walk into his local town, have a cup of coffee, and no one troubled him. He did not need security. He did not need an entourage. He lived like everybody else. And he called it, with complete sincerity, a priceless thing. The man who had stood in front of stampeding dinosaurs and the menace of Cold War submarines and the aching silence of colonial New Zealand on the world's biggest screens came home, in the end, to the same place he had always been, most fully himself, among the vines, in the mountains, in a landscape that made no concessions to celebrity and asked nothing of him except that he pay attention. He paid attention. For 78 years, with great consistency and considerable joy, he paid attention. That is the legacy of Sam Neill. Not the films alone, though the films are extraordinary. Not the awards, though the awards were earned. But the example, quiet, unassuming, and entirely consistent across a lifetime, of what it looks like when a person of genuine talent refuses to be consumed by the machine that wishes to consume them. When a man builds a life around the things that actually matter to him and treats fame as the useful but secondary phenomenon it is. When someone shows you, through the daily evidence of how they live, that it is possible to be remarkable without being performed. That it is possible to be exactly who you are, in front of 20 million people, or in a vineyard in Central Otago, and have that be enough. More than enough. Everything. Go well, Sam. There was too much left to do. There always is. But what you did, how thoroughly and honestly you did it, was more than most of us will manage in a lifetime. And the wine, we are told, is completely and utterly delicious. If this tribute to Sam Neill moved you, if his life reminded you that the most interesting people are usually the ones who care least about being interesting, leave a comment below and tell us what his work meant to you. What was the film, the scene, the moment that made you stop and think, this man is something different? We read every word. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe now and stay with us, because every week we tell the stories behind the legends, the real stories, the ones that happen off the screen, in the vineyards, in the hospital wards, in the quiet rooms where character is made without any audience watching. Sam Neill knew that room well. He spent most of his best life there.